So this story is decades old, and I haven't been reminding myself of this story for a while. So thank you, first of all, very much for giving me the opportunity to tell it this many years on. And hopefully it will give shed some light or deepen some understanding of some aspects of what goes out there in the world and what it's like to be in a war as a child, and also how it shapes us when 30 years on. So I was born in 1976, and that makes me 45, I think, yes. And in what was called Yugoslavia then, but it was in Croatia. So Yugoslavia was made up of 7 republics, and Croatia was one of those republics. So it was generally good times, there was mom and dad and younger sister and extensive family and friends and great school holidays and just happy times. So we didn't know much about war other than what we used to learn about the Second World War, when the Great Communist Party won against the Nazis, which is what we were always been told. That was daily at school. We were learning about that, but it was also to do with, that will never happen again. I just happened to have a cat joining me, not just now. And so these are my 2 schools. So you can see how important they are. There's these monumental buildings, sort of the primary school and the secondary school in a town called Karlovac. So Karlovac has about 50,000 population, and the secondary school, I always talk about, my claim to fame is Nikola Tesla and I went to the same high school, but not at the same time. That's always the decision so this is what home looked like. The reason I have these sort of almost look like stock pictures is because I haven't got any pictures of my childhood, or as many, and I'll tell you why that is. But this is one of the buildings that I managed to find on Google last night. That is not the building I lived in, but it's identical to the one I lived in, but just I couldn't find a picture of that. And basically this type of building is mainstream housing, was mainstream housing, it still is. And it's 2 or 3 bedroom flats, and basically your teachers and your lawyers and your doctors and everything in between lives in a dwelling unit like this. Is just how social housing looked. And my sister and I shared a bedroom because we had our elderly granny live with us, because granddad died and she would have been too weak to live on her own. So we always had a live-in granny, which meant one of us had to give up a bedroom. So. And then all of a sudden in 1991, we got uprooted and we had to leave our home suddenly. And it was one of those things, I heard in one of our CPD sessions when we do a backpack story, and the backpack story is, what would you, if you had 2 minutes and put items of importance in the backpack and then run and leave your home, what would you take? And it's 2 minutes. There's nothing more to, there's not enough time to think about what you want to take. So what I always loved and still love was my dictionaries, my English dictionaries, because the English language is my first love. I always loved learning English. So I actually managed to grab my dictionaries and some summer clothes and go. But I'll tell you how that happened. So we were a Serbian ethnic family in Croatia, and Croatia was starting to understand its national identity again. And anyone who wasn't Croatian ethnically was an enemy. So Serbs were definitely a big enemy. So Dad, who was a high rank, no, it wasn't high ranking, but he was in the public eye because he was a journalist. He had a tip-off that this was before the actual armed conflict started, he had a tip off that we would be attacked during one night. So he organized for us, my sister and I, to be moved to our auntie's house in the country where we would be safe. And a week later, right enough, the flat was attacked in the middle of the night, and mom and dad and granny were still in it, and they all survived somehow. But they had to leave within an hour of that happening. So basically in the middle of the night, it was 2:30 in the morning when, massive explosion happened. A rocket was fired into our balcony, but what they've done is they missed. So it got lodged underneath the balcony, but exploded. And then there was lots of shrapnel and then there was automatic gunfire at the flat itself because we were on the first floor. So this was all done from the road by unknown men. And so we knew this was more or less going to happen. As much as everything, it sounds really unbelievable that in peacetime you would be attacked for being one thing over the other without having done anything wrong. So that's why dad didn't fully that's why dad did ship us out. But had he thought it was really going to happen, he would have probably gone as well. But there was a thought in the back of his head thinking maybe it isn't going to happen. However, it did happen. And what was very interesting, our Croatian neighbors didn't help clean up and pack. When mom and dad were packing up and leaving, another neighbor broke into our flat straight after they left. This is what we were told by our friends afterwards. Broke into the flat, changed the lock, and basically taken everything, possession of the entire flat. Your entire home is now somebody else's. So that's how we lost our family photographs. So all the albums and everything. We had never had access to any of the things again. So, at the time, my Barbies and my roller skates was the biggest thing. I managed to take my dictionaries because that's something I would read when I'm bored. Yeah, that's how nerdy I am. But the roller skates were I was really missing them. I was really sad that I wasn't going to get them because I got them specially from Switzerland, which was quite a feat, considering that we were all sort of in a communist country. We wouldn't get foreign goods that easily. So we moved into, I'm getting a feedback here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So we moved into our old ancestors' home that wasn't really fit for habitation. There was no toilet, no running water. And that's just because of how the house was. It was my dad's birth home, but he'd hardly ever, done anything with it. So, but that was now the only place we could go that was safe. And, but soon after that, there was the electricity was cut off because of the location where we were. We were sort of under siege by various different front lines that moved daily. So you never knew which side you were on and whether you were safe because it's such a small area and there was a lot of fighting. And, so then mom was fired from her job because she failed to return to work after summer holidays. When somebody shoots at you, you kind of, the hint is not to come back, but that was a reason for mom being fired. And then dad got a different job as a journalist reporting for a new Serbian TV station, but he wasn't getting paid regularly. And what was interesting is that the money wasn't even relevant at that time because there was no electricity, so there was no supply chains. So the shops were just closing one by one. Nothing was getting through to the shops. There was no refrigeration. So what mom has done is started up a garden, a vegetable garden, and we essentially ate beans, potatoes, and eggs for months. The villagers gave us some milk and some eggs because they were overproducing now. Normally they would be selling it on, but everything is broken down. The entire social system is broken down. So now everybody had more of something and not the other. So they were able to give us overproduction of eggs and milk. So that was an interesting thing, not eat anything sugary for I don't know how long, all of a sudden became normal. And, we would hear shelling and fighting regularly, and sometimes we would have to go into the basement at night. We slept fully clothed in winter because it was cold, but also because if we had to run really quickly, we wouldn't have time to get dressed, and we wouldn't want to wait for Croatian army on foot, because that's just not an option. So so we missed one term of school altogether until schools got themselves organized. Most of the kids were just like me, just a displaced refugee kids, similar to me. And then we moved schools again. And then as we were moving with my dad's work, we were only ever moving in a majority Serbian area because we were safe, because we were Serbs. But it didn't mean that we were treated with respect either. So, you're always a newcomer somewhere. So I had a slightly different accent, and I was mocked daily for my accent, by people who I didn't speak the same as in, say, in the Serbian parts of Bosnia. So I decided I always going to be different, and then that's okay. But although our family miraculously stayed together and alive, not everyone was lucky. So my friends' parents split up because it was too much pressure, or they simply got killed in the fightings or the shelling. And then you'd constantly live with reports of neighbors being brutally killed because they lived too close to the border, and then stories of mass graves and genocide, and just general images of devastation, and every house in every Serbian village being burnt to the ground so that Serbs wouldn't return to their villages became normal to us. So upon completing high school, I started working with the UN as an interpreter, and I had also worked with Medicine Sans Frontières, delivering medical food and emergency to refugees, to refugee centers, and elsewhere in the country. This has really helped me get confidence as an 18-year-old young woman stepping out in the world with a mission of my own. So this was my first job, It's a big first job, and it was to help people. So it's always been about helping people for me. And I've been in Scotland now for 21 years, and I consider Scotland my home. I've moved here with my husband with my husband, whom I met when we worked for the UN in Bosnia, and it did shape me into who I am today. So it's how I am as an adult, how I am as a parent, and the fact that I would say I have thick skin and I don't sweat the small stuff, and I'm the most positive person I know, and I know lots of positive people. And I have compassion for all beings, and especially in political conflict, we never know what's going on behind, what's really going on, because the media will never show us nearly all the picture. So I know the life's too short, and that it's really about being grateful for every day and for what we have. So this is a huge story for me, right? So there's no way I can even begin to tell you the entire story. So I thought I'll give you a little sketch of what it is, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have specifically, because I think I know the answers to them. Thank you very much for your time.
And I have to say thank you, Natalija, for sharing your story. It was really, really interesting to hear. Feel very grateful to have been, for you telling it. So I will exactly talk a bit about maybe a different perspective and just my experiences really, from as it says to work as an aid worker in refugee camps in Europe and the Middle East. And I know some of you have heard a bit about this because I've had a bit of a presentation before. But I think because I've worked in 3 places, I've worked in Greece, Turkey, and Iraq. And when I've talked about this before, I'd only just worked in Greece, maybe half the time I was there. And I think now, having been also in Turkey and in Iraq, which are widely different contexts in so many ways, just the country, but also the kind of migration context as well. I think maybe it's given myself a bit of a perspective, which I hope to get introduced in here as well. So I'll start off just right away with my experiences of working in Greece, and then I'll continue with my experience of working in Iraq as well. I won't talk too much about Turkey, but feel free to ask questions about that as well. So if I can, there we go. So when it comes to the refugee situation in Greece, I think that's maybe the one that most of us in the UK or just in Europe in general are quite familiar with. It's what we've seen on headlines. It's what's in the news, really. But the thing is, it's actually changed a lot since it kind of started in 2014-15. So right now there's about 120,000 refugees in Greece. 100,000 are on the mainland, so mainly around Athens and Thessaloniki, the bigger cities. And some are living in camps, but most of them are actually staying in what's called like urban areas, so in rented flats. And these can be provided by different aid organizations or by themselves as well. And then you have 20,000 that are housed or resident on the islands, and it's mainly the 3 islands: Lesbos, Samos, and Chios. So when I worked, I was on Lesbos, and the reason why there's a lot of people, especially on these 3 islands, is simply because they're close to Turkey. So if you go by the sea route from Turkey to Greece, this is where you will get. So back in 2014-15, when a lot of people were coming to Greece to begin with, it was seen as kind of an entry point to Europe, or more so the EU. And back then there were lots of people coming, more than it is now. But it was also different in that when you arrived, say you arrived on the island, you would be put in what's called a reception identification center, which is basically a camp, a temporary one, where you stay both for quarantine, but also for submitting your application, your asylum application. And in 2015, this application would be processed and almost always accepted within just a few days. And within those days, you would also be put on a ferry or a plane or any other mode of transport to continue somewhere else in Europe. So you wouldn't, just because you reached Greece, didn't mean that that's where you would end up, but you would be go further into Europe to, I mean, any country, but most likely Germany or Sweden or France or any country like that. What's different today is that people arriving now, they submit their application, but then it won't be processed for months, and sometimes even a year. And when it is processed, it's almost, I mean, it's quite often declined, which means that people have to lodge several applications on and on again, and you lose funding after some time, and there's a lot of different kind of consequences of it. The general kind of conditions in these camps are quite dire, as you might expect. These camps on the island are, I mean, they're built to be temporary ones, and it's a lot of politics, both from the EU level, but also from the Greek level, where you can't actually build houses or anything better, even though people are staying there for years. So everything they do is set up tents. And the tents that you see in the both top pictures are the most common ones, and it's up to 12 people in one of these tents. So usually would be 2 families splitting one, with just kind of like some fabric between them. You also have, I mean, food and clothing is handed out, which means there's not a lot of choice in it yourself what you want to have. You're just given what, and you have take whatever is given to you. You have the toilets, which are the portaloos, and it's about 30 people to one toilet. And that, alongside with a lot of outbreaks of different diseases, means that it's just not, the sanitary conditions are not well at all. You also don't have schools, you don't have any health clinics, there's just really nothing to do. So you can imagine being stuck there for as long as 2 years. It is very, I mean, apart from, I can't imagine, but the many, like the range of emotions, there's especially a lot of boredom. People are generally just quite bored, alongside any other emotion and all of them that might be. You also have this camp is like it has a big fence around it, all around it, and barbed wire and everything. And in normal circumstances, any resident would be able to enter and exit just as they liked. But with COVID restrictions, this was changed. So at first, people could only enter and exit once a week. So they got a specific day where they could go out. They could go out, do any shopping they wanted, or go to the dentist or any healthcare appointment. But when I was there just about a year ago, and the COVID restrictions were at their strictest in Greece in general, this was completely taken away. So there was no way of entering or exit if you were not an aid worker. So anyone resident in the camp were just confined to this small space, and just simply couldn't leave. And it's also important to remember that most people that are here, they're not here seeing Greece as their destination. Greece is simply the transit country. A lot of people have other relatives that are in other countries that maybe arrived in 2014, 15. So I think the boredom is really something you notice quite early on, because you're just waiting to hear what will happen and if you can go somewhere else or not, and what you will have to do then. So working here or volunteering, as almost anyone who is actually working in Greece, they're most likely to be volunteering, is really showing up and just doing whatever is needed. It's very hands-on work, and there's a lot of small grassroots organizations that maybe just work in one camp or maybe just in a few locations. There's a lot of cooperation, and you kind of just show up and do whatever's needed. So when I was there was a lot of focus on like preventive measures, and also helping just to kind of cope with heavy rainfalls and the floodings that would happen as well. Because the tents are, they're not waterproof, and they're also just put on the ground. So whenever even just the slightest of rain, everything would get wet. And then with the heavy rain, the tent would actually get flooded inside them. So we would dig these trenches to try and get the water to run away, and we would fill sandbags as kind of walls to keep the rainwater out as well. And in general, working or volunteering in Greece is very characterized by there's very little money. There's not a lot of money going to the aid work in Greece. Comparing to other places in Europe, there is, but comparing like globally, it's not a lot at all. And most organizations are relying on crowdfunding or really small kind of project grants. But there's no like DFID or FCDO money. There's nothing like that coming into Greece, at those scales at least. And I think I will move on to Iraq. But yes. So after working in Greece for a few months, I worked in Turkey for a few months, and then just this year I've been working in Iraq for a few months. And working there, I was working in the DAHUK, which is the far north, close to the border to Turkey. It's in the Kurdish area, and the two pictures on the left is generally what it looks like. So when it comes to Iraq, there's a lot of the history which plays in and really affects what the country is today. I mean, Iraq gained an independence in the 30s, but has since just had a series of never-ending conflict and violence in different parts, at different levels, just some kind of constant conflict, sometimes just within countries, sometimes across borders. And there's been a lot of intelligent people analyzing this, and I mean, it's difficult to say just what it is, but I think there's two factors quite often come up, and it's generally the oil resources that the country has, and secondly, the very, very diverse makeup of the country. And this is both ethnicities, cultures, religions. It's just a very, very diverse country, and very divided in which groups or ethnicities or religions are the kind of majority in different areas. So this all means that you have migration patterns that are constantly changing, and they're very different from what you have in Greece, because you have people, I mean, you have refugees, so people fleeing another country, seeking safety in a different country. So say Syrians seeking refuge in Iraq, but then you also have a lot of internally displaced people. So Iraqi nationals fleeing their hometown village or town for another place in Iraq to seek safety. And this is constantly changing. So for instance, during the US invasion of Iraq, you had people fleeing from Iraq to Syria, but then when the civil war started, you had people fleeing back from Syria to Iraq, but then you had ISIS in Iraq, and they had to flee. And it's just constantly changing migration patterns, which really affects the work when you're there, but also kind of how the country is today. So when it comes to kind of the conditions that refugees and IDPs find themselves in Iraq, they're also quite different. Because refugees coming from Syria have been in Iraq for 10 years, basically. So what started as these refugee camps with tents that they were staying in have now just turned into smaller villages. And these are the top photos that you can see. Both of them are from the refugee camp that I worked in called Domus. And so it's also only Syrian refugees there. There's no one from any other country or anything. It's very divided like that in Iraq. And it's really like a town. You have houses built, you have your own water tanks, you have like a full shopping street with not just grocery stores or food stalls, but like a wedding dress tailor or a photographer. Like all these things are in this camp. You also have multiple schools, multiple hospitals, mental health clinics. A lot of things are there, a lot of services. But then when you look at the two bottom pictures, that's from an IDP camp. And those camps, because people, the internally displaced people are mostly Yazidi people, and they kind of had to flee from the start, or from 2014-15, when there was a genocide of Yazidi people in the kind of Mosul area by ISIS. So these camps are newer, and there's also a lot of efforts put in by the Iraqi government to have the IDPs return to their hometowns. So they're much more, I mean, they want the camps to be temporary because they don't want these villages to pop up. They want people to be able to return to their hometown, the home villages, really. And just quickly, what that means working there means, of course, comparing to Greece, it's a completely different context. The economy is very different. I mean, politically, you have a long history of dictatorship, and then you also have a lot of corruption going on today. And culturally, you have a lot of different cultures, but for instance, in where I was in the Kurdish areas, the Syrian refugees that are arriving there are actually Kurdish themselves. So they all speak the same language as the locals, which is not the same thing in Greece, where you have Arabs or people from Afghanistan arriving, speaking like a different language. They don't speak Greek, really. And you also have the returns that are encouraged, where IDPs are encouraged to return to their hometowns, and just migration patterns that are constantly changing, but also kind of consistent in that they're there, and they're probably going to be there. They have been there for a long time, and they're probably going to be there for a long time, which means that from a different perspective, where in Greece you have very little money for the aid sector, in Iraq you have a lot of money. You have, I mean, there's no small projects. All the projects have to be big. They're usually for a few years. There's big budgets. There's a lot of people involved, and it's all very measured, which is good, but makes it less flexible. And that also means, from my perspective, working there, if in Greece I was more working hands-on, in Iraq it's much more, you're sitting in front of a computer, you're basically in an office just drafting out projects. I mean, having conversations with different funding, like different donors and funding agencies, drafting up budgets and things like that. But something else that also would be different is the fact that in Iraq there's a lot more focus on local capacity building. So one of these photos on the bottom, where there's a group of people sitting around the table, is, for instance, a really short thing I did where I organized an English class for a local NGO. And that's more to make them kind of completely able to work themselves. Because right now, local NGOs are relying on international NGOs to get funding. But you want to take away that middle hand, because it's a waste of money, really, as well. So that's, I think I've talked for a bit too long now, so I'm just going to end it there.